Hello and welcome again. I'm Jo Gakonga, and this month's video from elttraining.com is all about using roleplay for language learning. So the first question's a good one. Why use roleplay at all? Well, there are lots of reasons, really. The big one, I suppose, is that it helps rehearse real life situations. You can have situations in the classroom and practice them in a safe environment that learners can then go and use in the real world. So, this sort of thing in the market is an obvious example in a cafe. It's work situations, interviews. There are many, many situations which will likely to come up in learners' lives that they're going to have to use in L2 that they might want to practice first in the classroom. Another good reason for roleplay is just that they can be engaging and enjoyable and memorable. So, it can be something that's a lot of fun to do in the classroom. Learners generally like it. And I think that it is often memorable in the classroom, that the language is memorable. So that's really important. I've got here that it may lower a learner's affective filter. So this is Krashen's hypothesis that learners have this affective filter, which means that they're a bit embarrassed in a classroom about using L2, using English in this case, and this doesn't help them to speak. So if you can lower that, if you can make things more comfortable, if you can make things easier, then it might help with their language development, particularly perhaps if they're a bit shy. So building confidence really is a really important part of this, and roleplay can help with this. Now, people think of roleplay as being somebody else, but you could be yourself perfectly well in a roleplay, or of course somebody else. So don't just think because it's roleplay you have to be acting as someone else. You really don't have to be. There are many situations in which you might be playing the situation. You don't have to necessarily be playing another person. I think one of the things which will really make a difference to a role play in a classroom is whether the teacher believes it's going to work or not. So if you're watching this now and thinking, I just couldn't do that with my class, well then I would advise you not to try. Because I think that belief is really a big part of it. If you believe it, if you take the learners along with you in your belief, they'll go with it and it'll be fine. If you go in with less than 100% belief that it will work, it probably won't. So, you need to develop your own belief in it first. So what can roleplay teach? Well, clearly you've got this idea of fluency or accuracy. Mostly, roleplay is going to be going towards the fluency side. It's going to enable learners to have practice of the language in larger chunks in a freer kind of way. So largely fluency, although you could also be working on accuracy in roleplay type of situations, but mostly it's going to be more about teaching fluency. It's really good, particularly for functional language. So by functional language, I mean language which is about a particular function, of course. For example, apologising, buying something, complaining, these kind of functions that language has. So not necessarily particular individual discrete items of language, but bigger chunks of language which fulfil a particular purpose. It is also good, though, for vocabulary practice and grammar practice. You can use this for all sorts of things depending on the situation you put in, but functional language is the big one. In her very excellent book on roleplay, Gillian Porter-Labdouce talks about 3 different types of situations for roleplay. So she says that there are authentic situations, situations in which the learner might actually find themselves, for example, in a cafe. There are potentially authentic situations, situations that the learner might not have experienced but potentially could. So, for example, complaining about food in a restaurant. And then there are also fantasy situations that they won't have been in. It just because these are fantasy situations doesn't make them unrealistic. I think it's important to realise, though, that these kind of fantasy situations can be the most interesting ones, so don't dismiss them just because they're not real. It is worth thinking about choosing your subject with care. As with a lot of things in the classroom, subjects which are a bit more controversial often have more interest, but clearly you have to know your learners well, and you have to be a bit careful about not upsetting them. So let's look at some practical examples. So right from lower levels, from very low levels, starting from a dialogue works very well. So here we've got a very normal situation in a shop, for example, with a shopkeeper and a customer, and the shopkeeper says, "Hello, what can I get you?" The customer says, "I'm not sure. What cheese is the nicest?" "Oh, they're all nice, but this one's my favourite. Would you like to try a bit?" While you're doing this, hopefully you're eliciting this from the learners and also drilling with them to make sure that they've got the pronunciation of this and that they understand these structures. "Yes, please. Oh, yes, it's really tasty. How much is it?" "That piece is £2.56. Shall I wrap it up?" "That's great. Thanks." So you've got a little dialogue here. You can get them to practice this in pairs. You can get rid of half of it and get them practice in pairs again. You can get rid of another half of it and get them to practice in pairs again. So you're essentially getting them to learn this dialogue. And then wipe the whole thing off and get them to do the same thing or something similar. Okay, now go and buy some meat. Now go and buy some vegetables. Now go and buy whatever it is that you need. So that you've already given them a really strong structure with language that they can use, but maybe you have to alter it a little bit. So at lower levels, giving them this kind of very strong structure can really help. At slightly higher levels, starting from a situation can work really well. Here's an example. So student A, half the class, you give them this situation. You're going to London for a job interview next week, you can't afford a hotel, an old friend lives there, you haven't seen them for years. Call your friend and ask if you can stay the night. So you then give the other half of the class, and I would split this half and half physically across the class. Student B, the person who calls you is someone you haven't seen for 10 years. You haven't kept in touch because you didn't like them very much. You live in a very small flat in London and you hate having visitors, but you are a very polite person. So you then give the student A's and the student B's in two groups, groups of student A, groups of student B, time to prepare what they're going to say to each other, how they're going to ask politely but insist, how are they going to refuse politely but, definitely refuse. So think about language for this. You can be going around helping them, meanwhile inputting some language, and then regroup the learners. So you've got an A with a B and get them to go and see if they can persuade their friend to let them stay. There's a question here whether role cards are useful or not. With a situation like the one I've just showed you, you could give them role cards with that on, or you could just tell them the situation. So whether you use role cards or not, if you do, I think the important thing to remember that if you do give them cards, they need to be fairly simple, because otherwise they end up being rather distracting and the learners have got the cards and they're reading the cards and they're not working so much on the language that they're having to use. Realia and visual aids can be really helpful to make this sort of thing feel more authentic, perhaps. So that's something to think about. If you're in the market, doing the selling them in the market, take some fruit in, for example. Another thing that can really help is if they've got a task to complete. So in the situation one that I just showed you, for example, they've got to try and persuade their friend to let them stay. The friend's got to try to refuse. So you've got a task, a sort of an end point to the discussion there. The other thing to think about, of course, is don't forget to input useful language. We are talking about a language lesson here, so during their preparation time, for example, you can input language which is useful. I'm going to show you another example now. I have shown you this one before on another video, but it's such a nice one that I think it bears repeating. Show the learners a picture of a Ferrari and tell them that this is your new car. It'll be amazing how many of them will believe you, actually, despite the fact you're on a teacher's salary. Tell them this is your new car, you're very proud of it, and your 18-year-old son or daughter has just passed their driving test and they also really want to drive the car. Now, you put them in two groups of parents, the people who own the car, and groups of teenagers, those who want to drive the car. Again, input some language here. Is there any chance of me driving the car? Would you mind if I drove the car? So we've got all this kind of language here of asking polite questions. I'd be really careful, the second conditional type of things. And the parents, of course, saying, no, I don't think that's a great idea. I'd like to, but... So think about refusing politely here. So again, functional language. What you then need to do, again, as with the other situation, is to regroup them. You can put them in two lines like this. This works very well for groupings, so that once they've talked to their one partner, they can then very easily swap partners and talk to another one. In this case, I usually get them to talk to 3 different partners and see which one they can persuade. I ask the parents after which teenager was the most persuasive. Afterwards, you can also put some error correction up. So rather than interrupting them while they're talking, you could listen to what they're saying, write up some of the things you hear on the board, and then get them in pairs to try to correct these errors. This is quite a nice way of doing error correction, because it means that although if I've made that mistake, I'll know it's me and I'll get the benefit of that correction, nobody else in the class needs to know it's me. So it's quite anonymous. And I think from that point of view, it's helpful. Note then with role play, it's important to give time for preparation. Remember, in both of the situations I've showed you, we've had time for preparation. With the dialogue, we've had time for drilling and trying to learn it. With the situations, we've had time for working with someone who has the same role as I do to prepare what we're going to say. This will make it go a lot better. If you just give people roles and say, get on and do it, you're likely to be met with silence. Input language. Give them language that's going to be useful for this task. Often that will be functional language, but it may be vocabulary, it may be grammar. Make opportunities for repetition. This sort of thing works very well if you can do the same thing 2 or 3 times. So with the Ferrari, for example, you've got the situation of having to try to persuade different parents, and for the parents to see which one was the most persuasive. You could do a similar thing for the people who are trying to get a bed for the night. So opportunities for repetition. Going back to the market role play, you could get them to go and buy 3 different things from 3 different people. So opportunities for natural repetition are really important. And give feedback afterwards. Do listen to what they're saying so that they feel as if this is useful and they're getting something from it, and it isn't just you setting it up and sitting in the corner ignoring them. So delayed correction particularly can be really helpful. Scrivener also talks about what he calls real play rather than role play. So in this situation, he suggests, I think he's right, it would be particularly useful for things like business English, where people are using English in a particular situation. So he says that you can ask people to make their own situation that's useful for them and relevant to their English use. He suggests giving these kind of questions and asking them to fill in a form like this, saying who are the people talking, where are you, what you're talking about. so that you start off the role play and then they role play or real play the situation which is appropriate to their real life. Other ideas are just using situations that you find in newspapers, in texts you use in the class, YouTube, videos, listenings from course books, readings from course books. If you find particular characters in those things, you may want to explore roleplay possibilities using those characters. So just as a quick recap, my golden rules for roleplay are: believe. If you believe they'll work, they probably will. Give a model and or give preparation time. So either learners need to know what they're going to do, or they're going to need to have preparation time so that they can prepare what they're going to say. This is important. These two things will make things go better. Giving learners a specific task to complete, something they have to do, an end point, will help, rather than just talk with your neighbour. Or so imagine you're talking with your neighbour, chat to them. That's a bit non-specific. Something with a specific task tends to work better. Input some useful language. This will often be functional language, but it may be other things, but do make sure that they're learning something new. As I said before, make sure you get opportunities for repetition here. That's really important. To do the same thing 2 or 3 times will be helpful for learners, especially if there's some feedback between the times. And finally, feedback. Make sure that you're giving them some input to start and some input to finish. Find out what they were making mistakes with, maybe work on that in future lessons as well. I mentioned this book earlier, Roleplay. It's a really nice book and it's got lots of good examples in here, so I would definitely recommend that one to you. And then finally, my main golden rule for this, I suppose, is just have fun. It can be a lot of fun, and it should be, so enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you next month. Thanks very much. Bye bye.